Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Just a friendly reminder that we also have a Patreon channel with a free 7-day trial and tiers as low as $5 a month. We do book club, special cultivation tips and tricks, monthly video hangouts to connect and share your grow, and even give out seed packs and other gifts at certain tier levels. I share my personal grow on there, as well as a private Discord channel for members. Your support of Patreon or sourcing your products through Kiss Organics is what supports the podcast, and I really appreciate it. Now on to the show. My guest this week is Dr. Matthew Indest. Matthew is a plant scientist, breeder, and cultivation strategist with over a decade of experience working at the intersection of plant genetics, agronomy, and commercial cannabis production. He has led large-scale breeding and cultivation programs across indoor, greenhouse, and outdoor systems for cannabis operators, with a focus on developing high-performing cultivars, improving plant health, and integrating data-driven systems for consistent yield and quality. With a PhD in plant science and a hands-on approach to solving real-world cultivation challenges, Dr. Indest brings both scientific rigor and practical insight to applied research. His consulting and advisory work emphasize the application of scientific research to commercial cultivation systems, bridging the gap between academic discovery and industry adoption. Now on to the show. Hey, Matthew, thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, good to be here, Tad. Appreciate the invite, and I've been listening to you for years, so happy to be a guest today.
Yeah, it was great to connect with you at PhotoX. I've seen articles and I've seen your name around the industry for a long time, and so I was just really glad we got to connect. And I'm excited to talk to you today specifically about some of the things that you've been working on or seeing in the industry now that you're working as a consultant. But can you give me a brief overview of sort of your journey in horticulture?
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I've been growing plants since I guess as a teenager. I was working in the gardens, helping my parents, grandparents, all that. And any chance to get outside and get my hands dirty was open to those opportunities. So it's kind of always an interest of mine, but then as I went to LSU, was studying just general biochemistry sciences, and found the whole horticulture degree program and really sucked me in. So I started working under a fruit and nut breeder. Gave me the opportunity to learn tissue culture, kind of introduced me to that whole realm, growing plants in a petri dish, and that was really exciting. So was able to work under him for a bit and transition to a doctoral program after getting my horticultural science as a bachelor's. And through the doctoral program, studied like seed-based row crop systems, corn, sorghum, and studied plant breeding and genetics to get my doctorate. So that was kind of my core academic world there at LSU. And then did a 2-year postdoc with the USDA on quality systems, also focused on cotton, but very heavily statistics oriented and data analytics oriented, looking at how we determine what quality is and how do we make sure it means the same thing across states, growers, and even international markets. So that was kind of I was always interested in cannabis production. But the opportunities to do so in Louisiana were pretty limited during those years. So I took more traditional, plant science routes and studied, where I could to understand the fundamentals of plant science.
Yeah, how different was it when you got into cannabis? Because I don't know your full journey. I know you were a lead, head cultivator at a pretty large MSO. Prior to branching out into your own consulting business. So can you touch a little bit about how that switch was, and then sort of what was different between, cannabis production and, your academic background with all these other, major crops and crop systems?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess both aspects going from academia research into private sector. I think that had its own set of transition elements to it, as well as working in traditional crops and into the kind of new frontier that is cannabis cultivation. I say new, I mean obviously we all know it's been cultivated for a lot longer, but getting into a more formal programs and things like that changes, I think, how we look at it. So going from like the academic side, very research oriented, I'd say that the pace of what is done definitely was a transition. Getting into the private sector, things move fast. Budgets are different; they're approved in different ways. So I think that was a very positive change for me because just sometimes government and research, academic research, can move pretty slow. Um, and for good reason. I think there's some elements to that of why it takes longer to complete a project and to be as detailed and as thorough. But working in a private sector, production oriented, like there's a whole different set of goals, and it's more output production focused. So I enjoy the pace and the challenge of that. You're able to see a lot more. Things are a lot less controlled in terms of like data and flow of things, but um, there really is a lot of opportunity in production environments to get a lot of insight and experience, especially if you structure it well. So that's kind of what I was interested in as I worked for large organizations, was capturing that data flow in an operational setting to still kind of look at things through a research lens and understand as much as we could out of a an operation, right? It's not structured research like replicated field trials or multi-year studies, but every harvest and every turn represents an opportunity to glean some new insight
Hmm.
and make sense of things. I'd say moving into cannabis specifically, working in these other cropping systems, like there's just a lot less information available. Um, and I'd say even the information that is available, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, and understand that like there's a lot of good observations and good information from people that are experiencing growing, but it might be very situationally applicable, or it's just an observation. It hasn't really been validated across environments or settings or things like that. So, um, yeah, there's just a lack of um, reliable information, and at the same, that means there's a lot of opportunities for people that are scientists and wanting to learn and wanting to develop new thoughts and ways of doing things.
Well, for me, that's what I love the most about cannabis as a crop is that there isn't all the research figured out for it. I feel like, and again, I'm not as much of an expert with these major crops as you are, but if we look at corn and soy and cotton, there's very specific ways of cultivation that are already figured out, and all the SOPs and methodologies are pretty well established as to how to optimize crop health and crop yield. Whereas with cannabis, we have people growing with a variety of genetics across a variety of different methodologies and also being cultivated indoors, using controlled environment agriculture, which you don't see with, these major crops that you were working with. What was the biggest challenge that you found with cannabis as a plant, um, cultivating it, like you mentioned, on scale, I guess. And I realized we were going to talk about scale second, so that's why I'm hesitating. But if you
No,
could give me a
okay.
quick answer on that, I do want to jump into and talk more specifically about this concept of using seed-based cultivation for cannabis, which you sound pretty excited about. So I just want to give people a
Yeah.
teaser.
Well, yeah.
But what are your challenges with cannabis as a major crop, jumping over from traditional crops? Let's start there.
Yeah. Well, I guess it kind of is a good segue. There's there are plenty of challenges, I think, but I'll just focus on genetics to kind of bridge the into that too. I think understanding what resources are available, right, for the cannabis, growers in new markets, established markets, even like getting good quality genetics that are going to reproduce according to what the marketing, or what's on the label. If I was working in tomatoes or, any of the other crops you mentioned, like there's been years of research to where if I go buy seed off the shelf, or find, cuttings, any type of propagule that might be available in other crops, it's a bit easier to expect some kind of consistency from that plant stock, whether it be, from a disease perspective, like there's clean plant programs out there. There's a number of vegetable ornamental catalogs that you can pull from and get a lot of information on how that variety is going to perform. Maybe not nailed down specifically to your environment, but maybe to your like agricultural zone. And coming into cannabis, like it's a bit of a roll of the dice, depending on, the breeders that you work with. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, understanding that genetics landscape, I think was kind of an initial, like, a learning curve and experience for me. Um, but I kind of expected coming into cannabis that there was a lot of opportunities uh, to, to learn something new and explore new, which, yeah, like you said, that was what excited you. And it's also what excited me. Working in cotton and other crops, like there's decades of research that not as exciting in some ways. So there was a lot of unknown coming in, and the genetics piece was what excited me. I did get the opportunity to really curate some menus and do breeding work. And there's a lot of good vendors out there, and there's a lot of seed packs that just don't perform as you would hope, right? They're not stable seed to seed, and that presents challenges, right? So one of the contracts that I have now is working with Refined Genetics, and they have a good catalog there. They've been working on stable F1 hybrid seeds for years now, and are working on commercial catalogs to kind of explore that with growers and help them adopt seed-based cultivation, which differs, I think, from how most people look at cultivating, right, which is from clones.
Yeah, I mean, I've always done clonal propagation. There's some arguments about overall vigor from a seed based plant versus a cloned plant in terms of root production. What do you see as being sort of the pros and cons associated with running plants from seed? We'll talk about consistency and all of that later, but just what are the differences between a clonally propagated plant and a seed grown plant?
Sure. Well, I think, yeah, there's definitely the timeline, right? If you're having to get a genetic, a clone of a genetic in hand and then scale up mother stock, there's depending on your process, it could take, and the quantity that you need if you're going from a single cutting to thousands of cuttings every week. You've got to be able to scale that mom stock, take those cuttings, be good at getting good rooted plants. So your timeline from acquiring that genetic to, having enough cuts to fill a production space is long, right? So that really lengthens the time. There's also risk of pests and disease, being brought in on a cutting, or as it sits in a mother room or in a prop room. Like there's a longer timeline for pests to kind of migrate in and establish on your crop if you're not diligent with your pest management program. So seeds inherently, like you can store them, if you buy 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 seeds, you can store them in a refrigerator or a freezer, if they're dried properly and kept from getting rehydrated. Those can be stored for years, right? They're maintain viability if stored properly. And then that allows you to draw from that as needed and still get consistent results. So again, it depends on the breeding work that's been done in the background to make sure that those are stable, true to type. But once you have that supply, they can be stored for a long time. So I think there's a lot of advantages, to that flexibility in your production schedule. The space required, you're not taking up real estate for mother stock, or you still have propagation space because you do have to sow your seeds. But what I've found too is that seeds can handle and actually prefer a much higher light level than what you would traditionally run in a clone room.
Hmm.
So if your clone room is, 75, maybe 150 ppfd, in order to get those plants to root and get established as a clone, seeds are, able to handle, like, from the day they pop out of that cube or whatever propagation media you're using, 300 to even 600 ppfd, right? They're charged, ready to go.
Wow.
They're not trying to, like, they have food reserves in them that can allow them to establish a root system without being stressed from that high light. And then they're off to the races. So um, what's also interesting is the architecture, right? If you take a cutting, you have a different alternating node structure because of how it was propagated off the plant. Whereas with a seed, you've got these opposite nodes that are sort of balanced in that architecture. So the structure of the plant is different too, which is cool to see, and kind of gives a different, like, plant shape that supports itself differently, right? There's sort of balance to that branch structure, which is cool.
Yeah, I think the pathogen load, viroid load of clonal propagation is the biggest risk and detractant from that methodology. The advantage of it is it's
Yeah.
free, essentially. It's easy to do. Most people can have pretty good success cloning in a variety of different ways. With cannabis, it being a very easy plant to propagate. I do want to point out there is, as I understand it, and again, you can correct me, there is some risk of viroids and viruses with seeds and pathogens as well, but the risk is significantly lower than they would be with what can build up essentially in the tissue of um, a clonally propagated plant or mother plant.
Yeah. 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 So I guess viroid, that was another kind of new thing. I mean, obviously plants get sick, right? We knew that from other crops, but coming in, like, appreciating viroid and fusarium as, like, two major pests that affect cannabis, and there's others, I think that are more outdoor, but in controlled environments, we do see viroid and fusarium as being two major impacts on cannabis. So um, yeah, I mean, the impact of viroid in mother stock programs, it's sort of like, unless you know what to look for, those early symptoms are really hard to tell. You'll see kind of gradual decline in these gardens, rooting success, vigor, trichome development. There's a lot of indicators that you can see if you're trained to look for it. Um, but if you're not testing for it with PCR, like actually looking for that RNA that is what the viroid is made of, it's you're not able to get rid of it out of your mother stock because you don't necessarily know the plants that have it until the symptoms show up, and by that point it's too late. Um, and yeah, it can cause very serious cannabinoid loss and yield loss. I mean, both of those diseases, fusarium and viroid, like, you can spend a lot of time sort of chasing down other factors of, like, maybe it's how I'm irrigating or airflow, fertilizer, right? Like, the symptoms can appear like many other things, and so you can spend a lot of time sort of chasing down these other factors that weren't really the problem to begin with, just because of the way these diseases present. So
Yeah,
that's where seeds, yeah, they can be a route to cleaner plants. And there is potentially a risk of viroid transferring through seeds. But if the parent stock is clean, which, breeding companies should be doing their due diligence on ensuring they have clean plant stock, whether it's for breeding or for nurseries. Um, I really think that the transmission rate for viroid is going to be very low, even in, and I think that comes from like the maternal, right? If the mom that you are pollinating has viroid, then the seeds are more likely to carry it. But it's not the same as if you take a cutting.
Yeah. So what, when we talk about virus pathogen load, well, one thing I want to highlight is I think the reason these things present the way they do is because they have physiological effects on the plant that limit nutrient uptake, limit water uptake. They create things that are going to present symptoms that are similar to what we're seeing with these sorts of, if it was the fertilizer, it would show up similarly, even if there is sufficient fertility. So you do end up chasing your tail on those things. And I'll add that, like, in regards to pathogen testing with virus and viroids, it's become very affordable now too, relatively
Yeah.
speaking. So people should, that's always a good thing to just check off first and foremost if you are seeing an issue with vigor or health with one of your plants. But when we talk about this, my first thought goes to tissue culture, which you mentioned at the beginning of the show.
Mhm.
Tissue culture presents a lot of the same benefits that you're listing with seed-based production, with the added advantage of some of the clonal production stuff being the exact same genetic material and consistency in each plant. What's the differentiation in your eyes between seed-based? Where does seed-based cultivation commercially win out over tissue culture or clonal propagation?
Yeah, no, I like that question. Yeah, because I mean the way that tissue culture is presented, there's definitely advantages, right? And we see it, same in other crops, clean plant production models where you've got your Gen Zero coming directly out of tissue culture. It's been tested for disease, and you've got verified clean plant stock. Tissue culture is definitely like a great way to preserve genetics long term that have already been produced, and it's worthwhile to do that with parent lines in a breeding program. So they're not like mutually exclusive, I'll say that. But tissue culture, if done incorrectly, can also still not actually solve the problem. So depending on the technique and whether it's coupled to proper viroid testing, it doesn't necessarily clean it up, right? Just putting plants onto agar
Sure.
doesn't generate a clean plant. There's some technique that I'll admit I don't think I have the steady hand to do to get in. And I believe there was a presentation at PhotoX about how small of an X plant, or you have to get down to like this microscopic level in that meristem, the very tip of the growth, to actually get to viroid free material. It's 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 a skill set.
It
So and even with that transfer and getting it onto culture, viroid can still kind of linger in low quantities. So you have to test to make sure that it's actually clean. Um, so again, I think there's a place for tissue culture. Where it wins out, I think on the seed side is, there's an investment into breeding. It takes years, it takes space, it takes, a guided selection to get to these stable F1 hybrids. And it relies on having, good plant stock to begin with and having that backed up, say in tissue culture, and then working those lines over years. So from a preservation perspective, varieties that have been curated and are good clonal varieties, they're worth backing up into TC. But if I want to scale them into a production environment, it may take, especially from tissue culture, right? I've got to back it up, make sure it's clean, then scale it into that mom initial clone that I got. So now my timeline's even longer.
Yeah.
If I've got something in TC, the timeline to get it to, production and get it to market is now a year, 2 years. Whereas if we look at the investments on seed breeding, and we get to, inbred lines. We've got a set of inbred parent lines that then we can do crosses and make a lot of different F1 hybrid populations. Those seeds can be created in the millions of seeds and stored for decades. And then those are available with quick turn. So I think that's where the advantages come, is the ability to curate a large collection and access it in a quicker turnaround.
Yeah, I mean, tissue culture is amazing. It is very expensive. The timeline is a little bit of an unknown because you don't know how many generations of plant stock you'll have to go through to really clean that. Like you said, it's not just
Yeah,
like you run TC through a plant one time and it's clean. So there is an unknown amount of time, and it's months and is expensive.
yep,
My brain went straight to, because we're talking specifically about this, was at least on scale, a commercial scale. I would think if I put plants into tissue culture early, and then coming out of tissue culture, I know they're clean. We can set up micro propagation methods. You could get very consistent with timing on very large scale production. But as I say this, the one big limitation I see, and I see this with seed based propagation as well, or seed based cultivation, is the market is changing so rapidly in terms of what genetics are popular and what is wanted or needed, that is one thing that I think it would be very hard for someone to make a pivot quickly using either of those two methodologies versus a clone. You can just go pick up whatever the latest cultivar is and you're off and running with clonal propagation.
yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
yeah. No, it's I yeah, it's that's a whole topic I love to think about, because I mean, the idea of trying to chase some of these heights, like um, it's an interesting topic, because I would argue that by the time you hear about, and maybe I'm also behind in the circles of, what's hot and hip in the cannabis space. Uh, I've limited my social media interactions in general, so I know other people are more in tune to what's like coming up next. But even with, like, by the time that hits sort of a mainstream awareness, that timeline, even if you do get the next latest hottest cut, like, you might still be behind the wave. Um, so there is, some thought to sort of being a trendsetter and value there versus trying to chase, something that has made it to the market and has developed the hype. If you're getting a new cut at that point, you're already, again, 6 months to a year behind the ability of whoever already created that hype. So especially thinking from like the breeder's perspective, and having worked under somebody who was in, fruit and nut pecan breeding specifically. Pecan breeding is like 10 to 15 years to develop a new pecan variety. So there's a patience and a like long-term vision that breeders have to operate with. And I don't think every cultivator should really be doing their own genetics, like tissue culture, or breeding, right? I mean, I think all of us as cultivators are interested and love to do that kind of stuff, but I don't think every licensed, cultivator or grow should be dedicating that space. From a business perspective, it's not necessarily something that everybody has the space or, the organizational complexity to do correctly. So I think it makes a lot of sense to partner with people that do have that as a specialty and as a niche, those that have actually invested into the time, in order to, kind of focus on what each team is good at.
All right. So I know we got off on a tangent here. Bringing it back to seed based cultivation, which you see is sort of the future of commercial cannabis production.
Yeah,
You mentioned, you've already highlighted that it's probably a cleaner plant. You can get a cleaner plant. You can get lots of seeds rapidly, so you can get up and running faster. You mentioned storage of those genetics is a lot easier. what are some of the other benefits that you see with, because there's obviously some challenges. I know the first question that most people are going to have is phenotypic expression. Like, how do you get consistency from seed-based production? Which I have some thoughts on, but how would you address that question
Sure.
first and foremost?
Yeah. Yeah. No. I again, like that's popping. Going back to when I first popped some seeds and was thinking like I should be able to get. It's all named. Whatever variety name you pick off the shelf, like it's all the same, right? And then you pop it and you get just as many phenotypes as seeds you popped. So, from a clonal production model, that obviously has advantages where you get to now pheno hunt into that and sort of select the best out of this good by good cross. And there's really nothing that like is inherently invalid about that process. Like, other clonally produced crops, fruits and nuts, go through that type of um, production, genetic improvement cycle where like things that are grafted, you can go and combine these two parents and you get that. But where the advantage comes, especially for a crop that does produce seeds as prolifically as cannabis, is if we can get to these inbred populations, right? And so instead of just taking two good clonal varieties and crossing them, and then having all these offspring that represent an array of traits between the parents, like each individual has a randomly assorted mix of genes from both parents. By inbreeding those initial parents many generations, 5, 7, 10 generations, and applying selection pressure throughout that process, you develop a set of parent lines that are, homozygous, meaning they have consistent genes, in that makeup. So then when you combine those two inbred parents, you get an F1 hybrid line where the offspring has a combination from each parent that is uniform. So they get one set of chromosomes from one parent, another set of chromosomes from the other parent, and it's the same in every seed. And that's how large scale seed production works in row crops, and that's where that hybrid vigor comes from. Um, a lot of our agricultural yield improvements over the past decades have been attributed to hybrid based seed production in corn, soybeans, other crops. So um, these other crops have proven the advantages of hybrid seeds and how they are better than the other seed based models. So it's really about identifying, breeders that have done this, and I'll say that yeah, not all F1 hybrids on the market are the same. I think that term kind of gets loosely applied just because of how young the industry is in terms of like these technologies. An F1 population, when we're talking about breeding, is just simply that first cross between two breeding lines. So if I take two good parents, just clonally polyhybrid sort of things, and cross them, I have an F1 population. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be stable. What leads to the stability is that investment into the inbreeding process and the selection process. So again, that's where I was happy to align with Refined Genetics because they've been doing this like inbreeding parent line development for years at a scale that I really hadn't seen other producers do. And so, that investment has allowed for them to have commercially available stable seeds for growers to start to work with. Um, and I really think that's where we'll see more adoption. There's some changes in the way that we're growing because of these seeds, but I think they represent a net advantage for cultivators.
I will say this past year, when I was in Montana, I got to see a crop grown side by side between a local breeder and Phylos seed, both seed
Mhm.
based crops. And you saw the genetic diversity from the local breeder in terms of his plants were kind of, there was massive phenotypic expression, whereas the Phylos crop looked all exactly the same. And I'm not here to promote Phylos. I know they have a bit of a mixed reputation in the industry, rightfully so, for how some things went down a few years ago. But I will say I saw the crop; it looked very good. What I will say though is this was their fastest finishing crop because we're in Montana. Frost hits, they have crazy weather. They
Okay.
need a fast crop. The local breeders' material, their side, while genetically more diverse, was definitely further into flower and more likely to finish. So this Phylos crop,
Sure.
again, very even, very consistent, even though from seed, which speaks to what you're talking about with hybrid vigor. But it does look like we do have work to do on certain genetic expressions that we are looking for. In this case, senescence or finishing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, so this gets into like what we call genotype by environment interaction. And it's likely if that local breeder in Montana had been selecting for early finishing,
They have.
maybe less concerned for other traits, like the population may be more consistent in flowering time, but still have phenotypic variability for any other number of traits that were unselected. Um, so, breeding program, there's a lot of things that you can select for. It's disease resistance, finishing time, bud structure, soil type. There's anything that could present a unique grow environment. Those are things that could be selected for.
Powdery mildew
And
resistance,
that's
big one that
yeah,
we saw at this last conference we were at together.
yeah. And so that's again like we're still kind of in the forefront of what breeding is going to be for cannabis. And the ideally, you'd be able to select for all of these things and find that one shining plant to put on the pedestal there. But the reality is to stack all of these traits into a variety is difficult, if even possible, to capture all grow environments. Um, so, when looking at outdoor grow environments, the plants that are best suited for that environment may not be the same ones that are the indoor. So each environment, needs to have its own sort of trials, and that's where I get involved too, is setting up field trials to find which varieties are going to perform best in different environment types. Um, and really understand the needs of the cultivator to identify the right variety that's going to fit that grow environment. Um, and yeah, I think that's where there's a lot of opportunities to continue to advance, seed-based cultivation. Um, so I think again, it's interesting that the grower there, the breeder there, did have more consistency in that finish time. And so it's a matter of what traits mattered. Were they growing for flour or for oil production? Like, was there a specific product that they were looking to hit? Because that would also determine what you grow and how you need that plant to finish.
Yeah, absolutely. And they even acknowledge that like Phylos or any of these genetic, commercial large scale breeders have the capability to do multiple generations of plants. What he can do in a lifetime, they can do in under a year, or maybe even in a couple months because of the genetic testing that they have access to. They don't need to grow these plants all the way out. They don't have to wait till next season to try out the next cultivar. So it definitely speeds things up. I think of
Mhm.
it as someone who loves growing tomatoes as like to me the perfect tomato is the sun gold tomato. In terms of the amount of sugars in it, for a cherry tomato, it's by far my favorite. And I can walk into a vegetable garden and spot the sun gold or sun sugar or some variety of that uh, potential genetic heritage in a plant, and it's going to be vigorous, it's going to be fairly resistant to disease, it's going to produce really well, and it's going to produce a very consistent tomato that I enjoy eating. And so I could see where that appeal could apply to cannabis production as well. But on the flip side, because we have all of these different secondary metabolites that we don't fully understand. We have all these cannabinoids that we're still discovering and learning about how their interactions and symbioses lead to better medical or even psychedelic outcomes for a consumer. Do you worry that if we do adopt a commercial consistent seed production model, we will be losing genetic diversity over time, or access to genetics that could potentially be really beneficial to future generations of humans?
Yeah, no. So I get this question a lot, and have spoken on some panels about it as well. So I think that the distinguishing part here is that understanding that each sort of step in the cannabis industry doesn't have to like adopt all things, right? So if you're a large scale commercial operator, you don't need to necessarily be focused on like germplasm repository and preservation. That's a very specific field and function that I think does need to happen. And you see this in other crops as well. They're not wanting to lose diversity, even if those tomatoes don't make it to the market shelf. There's genes for disease resistance or genes for any number of other traits that are of future value. So there's that preservation work that needs to happen. But again, not every person that grows cannabis needs to focus on preservation. Now, the breeding companies that are successful and that will be successful are ones that have curated and collected germplasm from a very diverse group. Because when you go make those inbred parent lines, you don't want to just do it from every version of a cookies, cake, candy gas hybrid out there, right? Like you want to go back to the original sources of some of these land races. And Refined has done that. They've gone and gotten and collected these germplasm from across the world as the foundation for the breeding program. So having that diversity as your starting material, and continuing to look for those new characteristics and having them banked in tissue culture or in seed form gives you the foundation for you to develop lines that are commercially viable, have something unique, and can be distinguishing in the market. So I don't think that like genetic selection for commercial viability necessarily eliminates them from existence. I think again, it's focusing on things that can be produced at scale and meet quality expectations. But then as you preserve these varieties in the background, you have them available as the market shifts or in your breeding pipeline, so that 10 years from now, you're able to bring something to market that is unique, is competitive, has medical efficacy that was previously unknown. So I think a breeder is more interested in genetic preservation and incorporating that into line development than what a commercial producer would need to be focused on.
Going back to my tomato analogy, I will say, like, I don't just grow, even though I have a favorite cherry tomato, I don't just grow that cherry tomato. And then I also will grow a slicing tomato and, a sauce tomato. Like San Marzano is the best sauce tomato, in my opinion. But there's other tomatoes that serve that function. And there's also heirloom tomatoes that I intentionally grow every year just to see what generated this interest in this plant originally in the first place. So, I guess my point being is, when I compare this to cannabis, we will potentially have lines for, like you mentioned, for rosin or, fresh frozen or high-end flower, or, all of these things potentially have slightly different characteristics that we're going to be looking for from a breeding or genetic potential. The other thing, though, that I think about as you were saying this is, I wonder if we're going to see two different types of breeders in the future. And maybe this kind of already exists, but like as a home grower, I love the idea of getting a plant where I don't necessarily know what my phenotypic expression is going to be. It's kind of like rolling the dice. maybe I'll get something even a little bit better,
Yeah.
knowing I'm coming from a lineage that's so strong and has produced these amazing plants. And so that's exciting. Yes, my crop won't be as uniform. Yeah, I may not get, I'm going to have some losers in there too. But if I keep, getting in seeds from these companies and then, growing them out, I may eventually end up with something that's even better than what, these other breeders already have. So I hate to lose that too. And maybe that's the other side of things. Maybe there'll be people selling seeds specifically for that purpose as exists right now in the market.
Yeah, I mean, and it's different goals, right? If and it's funny you mentioned the sun gold. I still have some plants I picked 2 days ago. It's a benefit of being in the deep south here. The growing season's a bit longer than it sounds like you probably have in Montana. Um, the Yeah, I mean, growing for a hobby or personal interest is going to have different goals than growing in a commercial production facility. So your ability to, experiment and take different risks. There's certainly things that I plant or the timing of things that I plant here for my home garden is way different than what I would be doing in risks that I'd be taking in a commercial environment. Just the stakes are way different and the goals are different. I plant a ton of varieties and things like that that really have no commercial value and are really just personal interest and something to fill the landscape. Whereas in a business setting, we have to be mindful of, all of the canopy and the investments and the cost to produce. So those goals are certainly different. And I think that people who are, you know, interested as a home grower, like, yeah, pop the seeds that are going to be diverse and find the winners in there. Find those things that are fun and unique. That excitement is definitely um, worth the time and the space there. But from a commercial business perspective, then like those risks and the amount of investment into like R&D type space needs to be done conscientiously, so that it doesn't affect your overall,
So,
success.
so taking this seed-based model a little bit further, do you see us moving away from photoperiodic plants to autoflowers then? So seed-based autoflower production on scale in terms of large-scale commercial cannabis production.
I mean, there's definitely a place for autoflowers like already. I mean, 15 years plus being developed. Like the autoflowers from 2010 are way different than the autoflowers
Definitely.
from today.
Yeah.
It's only a one or a couple genes that result in an autoflower plant. So taking your favorite cannabis variety and introgressing that single gene into an established variety like can happen very fast. So that's the kind of like breeding efforts where somebody at some point was like, I know this autoflower plant doesn't look great and the flower quality is not there, but I bet if I crossed it with XYZ and continued to work that line, there's some real advantages there. So we're seeing varieties that have you know, better bag appeal, better potency, terpene profiles. Like I think, and and they certainly even in an outdoor environment, excuse me, in an outdoor environment offer serious advantages to your season compared to just like a single cycle of a photoperiod variety. From like again at a commercial scale, if you're growing autoflowers, you can get multiple harvests now per season. You can even stagger your harvests. In some environments, you could do a week over week harvest throughout the entire year, depending on your climate. Um, and so there's some real operational advantages to having a staggered harvest schedule versus like I've got a month to plant an entire 60 acres and I've got 2 months at best to harvest at the end of the year. Um, it's a massive undertaking to try to like take down large scale crops like that as a photoperiod variety. So yeah, I mean, I think autoflowers already do have a valuable place, and we'll only continue to see them get better. But that's a great example of like how breeding improvement in 10, 15 years has completely changed what was kind of laughed at.
Yeah.
If I remember reading on the forums,
Yeah, as someone
the
who follows an
something way
autoflower
different.
follow forum pretty regularly, I will say the quality of flower just in the last few years has gone up dramatically. Autoflowers are not
Yeah,
what people. If you haven't revisited them, I think people should. They absolutely have changed quite a bit. So that's a really good point.
yeah, very impressive too. Yeah, and those are all going to be seed based, right? So it's impressive to like plant a seed and in 60 days, like it is a fully formed, like finished flower plant. Like I don't know, it's pretty cool compared to some of the other timelines you have to wait for photoperiod genetics.
Yeah, and I think of the cost of seeds. So this was the other thing. It was affordability because like right now I can go buy
Yeah,
a pack of tomato seeds. I'll get 30 seeds. Let's say it's $4 for that pack. Cannabis seeds, especially from certain breeders, are hundreds of dollars in some cases. Where do you see us
yeah.
landing from a breeding perspective on cannabis production?
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned earlier the ease that the cannabis roots and propagates. But when you add up the costs, I mean, looking at nurseries that are providing cuttings and even their cost to produce, like cuttings, rooted cuttings could be $3, $5 or more, just from that, again, the mom stock, the labor to take cuttings. And this is taking, 10,000 or more cuts a week. Those steps add up. Um, and not every propagation room runs at 95 plus percent rooting success.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's that's always the goal, but not always the case for many reasons. So when we look at seeds, the cost for seeds from breeders, I mean, this could be $2.50 to even lower, $2, sometimes even less than $1. Again, depending on the genetics and the quality of the breeding, like from you get different value from different breeders. So I wouldn't just look at price and assume higher price is going to be a better quality, or just kind of look for the cheapest thing on the market just to save costs. So it's really about understanding the technical skill sets of the breeders that you're working with and kind of getting to know what their program entails, and understanding where that cost comes in. So um, there's a lot to sort of play at, but when you look at the cost for seeds, I think it's going to be lower than what you see in how much it costs to produce or buy rooted cuttings.
Do you see that price coming down in the in the next 5 years?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think seed prices are already competitive with clones, under $2, easily. And again, that kind of changes with bulk pricing. Um, so if people are interested in buying 10,000 seeds at a time, they'll be able to get a better price than a 10 pack, right? I think that's what you see online, 10 packs for 200, $500, like um, anything like that's uh, I think unique in the cannabis space. I don't think I've ever spent that much for my tomato seeds, no matter how good they were. Um, so yeah, I think so a lot of that changes with scale and with market maturation.
All right, so I want to kind of change topics here. One of the other
Sure.
things that we were going to talk about was cannabis production on scale, because you worked for one of the largest MSOs out there. You've seen scale. A lot of growers will argue that you can't produce high quality or craft product on scale. What are your thoughts around that?
Sure. No, I I'll say that it's not easy. That it's not something that people can just do right off the bat. And one of the important parts is like defining quality to begin with, and making sure that your processes are informing quality and that feedback loop happens. So Certainly like scaling too fast as operations like grow very quickly. They don't always achieve quality at scale because they're really just trying to um, get production going. So scaling too fast and not having established processes that are formalized, trained, that you've got people experienced in these processes. When we're looking at hiring teams that are 100 to 300 people, making sure that they're all in lockstep with a specific process that is quality oriented, it's a real challenge for growers. Um, so I think some of that comes with time and, you know, new buildings, new facilities, new things like that all come with a learning curve and a challenge. But no, I really do think that as the market matures and people become more experienced at scale, like I don't think it's impossible, and I have seen it done. So that's where I think having the right processes in place and people will gain experience at scale as time progresses. We're going to continue to see large scale producers produce, better quality over time if that's what they're focused on. So starting with like defining quality, that's usually where I like to start the conversation because it means different things to different people. And again, with my work at the USDA, that was a pretty important part when, we're looking at federal loan charts for commodities. Like, if I want to sell you this product and I'm saying it's quality A, but you're saying no, it's quality C, like we need to make sure that we're aligned on the terms.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a strong opinion one way or another on this because I kind of go back and forth. Because when I think of
Yeah,
other markets, like for example, when I think of, I don't know, bananas or corn or tomatoes, even, I think, yeah, you see quality product being produced by some of these, massive, massive companies putting out, tons of
way bigger than
kiwis and
cannabis
avocados and
operation.
all of corn, all of these things, right? I don't get corn from the store and think this is not the same quality that I could get at the farmer's market. I mean, we could argue freshness. That's an absolute conversation to have. And I think the
Yeah,
corn I grow in my garden is going to taste better because I can literally pick it and eat it within hours. Doesn't really apply for cannabis in the same way because of, curing and all of that. But then when I think of other industries like the beer industry or the coffee industry, and I think about like the best beer or coffee, it's usually these smaller craft brands. Like I can't think of a single large scale beer producer that I'm like, this is better than what I could get, from a local microbrewery. And maybe I don't know what that differentiation is. I don't know if at scaling at some level limits access to. I guess what I'm getting at is maybe there's something to be said for like a craft producer in the sense that they have access to inputs that aren't you're not limited by your input material. Whereas when you get to a certain scale, like everyone's using the same inputs, and when we get to commercial cannabis, if we apply that to commercial cannabis, now we're limited to certain salt-based companies for the most
mm,
part. So I think we tend to get the same fertigation programs and schedules. So some would say the weed all starts kind of tasting or looking the same. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Again, this is sort of a half baked thought as we're talking. So
no, 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 and that's a good point there. Like on the scalability, it's more reproducible, right? I think that's where, like you said, some producers are probably using the same inputs and same processes. So start to have like a convergence. That's where genetics kind of become a differentiator. Um, but yeah, I mean, even those craft breweries, like how many of them are owned and operated by, the large scale beer companies,
true.
and it's kind of been a consolidation because there's advantages to that scale. But yeah, understand. Like again, going back to like defining quality, I think early markets are typically like THC focused and whatever that label says, not so much focused on those subjective criteria of aroma, appearance, bud structure, and those types of like um, aspects of quality. Like they're not, that's not something that you can easily just put a number on, but you get a group of people to be, to a consensus, and you can develop subjective grading scales in order to say, this represents a certain quality tier and not. I mean, that's kind of the basis of the whole conversation is like my weed's better than yours, right? It's there has to be something measurable to do that. Otherwise, we're just both beating our chest and arguing. Let's just smoke this and move on instead
Yeah.
of arguing about it.
Yeah, that's a really good
Um,
point.
so yeah, and for those other commodities too, what you see on the shelf, right? The tomatoes that make it to the produce section, or the fruit that makes it onto those shelves is a specific grade of quality. And you can go from one shopping center to another, even right down the street from here. There's certain grocery stores I won't shop at for produce because every time I've gone there, there's been it doesn't ripen the same way. There's defects. Like it's just not the same quality produce as another brand. Um, and yeah, I mean, what you see on the shelf isn't necessarily all that was produced by the farms. They are grading them and sorting them. You have number one sweet potatoes, number two sweet potatoes that are graded based off of size, color. There's all these different things, and what I find fun is in the berry section. You see from like Driscoll's, there's like the sweetest batch, and some of these other different types of blueberries or blackberries, things like that, where they're differentiating, right? So it's likely produced at the same farm, but they've done further analytics, looked at sugar content, Brix content, or maybe it's a different variety. I don't know their exact product stream, but they've developed like another kind of premium tier product that means something more than just like it's better, right? There's a subjective appeal to that.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I think with a scaled organization, if they're focused on quality, they can define what those quality terms mean. And is every bud off of every plant going to hit that quality mark? No, likely not. You're going to have a breakout within each crop. And if you have processes in place to, say, 10% of this crop is able to hit that premium tier, and then you sort of have a cascading grade system, um, and that becomes challenging because not every operator is vertically integrated, and able to like capture each of those product SKUs all the way to market. So they've got to understand if I take down a room that's 1,000 pounds, and I don't have a value stream for trim, like it becomes a bigger burden than than another operator who can make other types of products, pre-rolls or extraction material, things like that. So um, when you're harvesting tomatoes, like you're not just getting marketable shelf-ready tomatoes. Some of those end up into a canning type jar or ketchup.
Yeah.
It's not like you're getting one type from every crop. So
That's a good point.
it's one of the challenges of growing.
That's why,
I say not every tomato I pick is something I'm going to eat.
yeah, that's why a lot of my friends won't buy pre rolls in the rec market here in Washington State because the quality is just not
You
what
don't
they
know.
want. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, when we talk about quality, I think what it comes back to me is we don't have a great way of defining it in cannabis. I have friends who are much more sophisticated and have much more, better taste and profiles or ability to differentiate taste than I do with
Hmm.
cannabis. And what I find is they can tell me that this is better than that, but they can't tell me necessarily what those there aren't necessarily quali- quantitative metrics that we can use for evaluating because we know high THC does not mean better weed. We know that. Like that's
Yeah,
fairly well established. It's researched when you do double blind trials with folks. A lot of times they picked lower THC cannabis as giving them a much better overall effect, or therapeutic benefit. We know that it's not purely looking at a bud. We know it's not purely the frostiness or trichome density doesn't tell the whole story, because we've discovered now with research that trichome density doesn't necessarily correlate with higher THC or higher levels secondary metabolite production. So we also know it's not fully terpenes, because we see things, plants that can be very high in myrcene, for example, and some people don't respond to that as well. So I guess my point is there's no particular like quantitative, observable, measurable metric or variable associated with cannabis plants. I mean, we can talk about what makes a bad bud, but I don't think we can fully encapsulate what makes a good bud. Whereas if we were talking about apples, for example, we can look at Brix levels, sugar and sweetness. We can talk about how crispy that apple is when you bite into it versus mushy. We can talk about mouthfeel.
yeah, the acid.
Yeah, acid. There, and we can get some of those things with cannabis because people do talk about mouthfeel and things like that, but it's a lot trickier.
Sure.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just not as well researched, right? And that's where again, like that's kind of there's not a singular metric, like to your point. I think that's first thing we need to appreciate is the complexity. I think as cannabis folks, like we appreciate the complexity there. So acknowledging what that means in terms of defining quality is an important step. And I guess this is a chance to bring up, one of my other roles is on the advisory board with the Cannabis Research Coalition, with Dr. Allison Justice and the other folks there. And a lot of the research that she's been doing is the science of smokability. One of the first studies they focused on was water activity and that impact on mouthfeel and sort of harshness, ash color. So those are some of the things that haven't been done formally. And a lot of institutions are not, they're going to kind of stay away from doing things like that. But Allison and the rest of the folks over there are putting efforts into it, and looking at what existing research there is in other smokable products like tobacco. And they do look at, the acidity of the material, the Brix content, the protein, nitrogen content, like the mineral content of the flower. I think that is going to definitely shape the way that cultivators are growing, because if you can start to figure out like what makes something a more pleasant experience, you will be able to tune your cultivation toward that, whether it's flushing practices or eliminating a certain nutrient after a certain timeline. The curing process, like there's still so much that we don't really even have enough like anecdote to know what to study to that level of detail. And so there's still plenty to do there. But I would say those same type of metrics that are done in flavor chemistry and in aroma chemistry and other crops, like there's likely things to be applied there on these other, in cannabis. So it's something to look to, right? If researchers, I like to look to other crops and see what's been done, and see what can be applied, because there's probably a lot of work already done to inform how we're going to apply that in cannabis.
Yeah, where do you see? Do you see more cannabis research? Because we are seeing more cannabis research, but are you seeing more of it happening in the future at the university level, or where do you think? Where do you think most research is going to be done moving forward here?
Yeah, I'd say domestically, I'm not seeing, there's a few organizations. I'll say SIU is one university that I've seen, like Oregon State,
Cornell.
Cornell. There's some others. They're all like hemp focused. So, when it comes to like cultivation and metabolite development, there's, hemp oriented. But a lot of these research institutions are, I think, out of fear, afraid to even, consider research on cannabis, or even hemp, right? They kind of get,
Do you think we need
put together.
differentiation there, or can we take things that we learned from hemp and apply it to cannabis, or do you think that they need to be approached differently?
I so so yeah, I think that there's some things that can be gleaned working with like floral hemp varieties on, cultivation practices and maybe metabolite pathways. There's some limits, obviously, there, both on the populations that you're able to work with. So some of the genes that are present in floral hemp varieties, just they're not going to be the same as the high THC side. Um, but I think there's some value to that research. I think private institutions are going to have a step ahead, because they're not worried about some of these federal funding concerns or other things that are like a university might be concerned with. But there are some, yeah, universities and organizations in Canada. I think we've seen a few folks there. Uh, Zamir Punja has done a lot of work on the viroid fusarium, like wealth of knowledge there. He's presenting at all the conferences on disease presence, and
Yep.
um, we were talking about Max Jones there on the polyploids, and some of that genetic work.
Do you want to touch on that at
Um,
all, since
but
you
it's still
since
new.
you did bring that up?
Sure.
What that means and what the implications are for cannabis breeders to have a commercially available polyploid plant? Ooh, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, polyploidy. Yeah, and again, I keep referencing like other crops, because that's where a lot of these techniques are being applied from. Um, and yeah, so when we talk about ploidy, this is referring to the number of copies of chromosomes that a organism has, a plant, a human, any other species. Um, and there's genetic manipulation techniques that allow you to double the chromosome set. So you can treat cells, and as it undergoes cell division, um, these chemicals inhibit, so you have the DNA doubles, the cell prepares to split, but these chemicals inhibit that split. So the DNA is doubled, but the cell stays intact. And so now that cell has two copies of DNA, of its chromosomes versus the normal count. So in plants, when you do this, let's stick with cannabis as the example. You have a doubling of the chromosome set, and now you have a tetraploid, which has four copies. A diploid has two copies of its chromosomes. As you go to breed, each of those copies goes to either a seed or pollen, and then those recombine, and that's how you get each generation. So when you double it, now you have four copies, and you have two sets now in your pollen or your egg, your ovule for the seed. So if those get mated to a standard diploid, um, you now have three copies of DNA in this cell, and now you have a triploid. Triploids are going to be, there's some breeders out there that have started to commercialize these. Refined has been working on them as well. And they represent things that are potentially seedless, like seedless watermelons are, developed through this triploid process. Um, and yeah, they offer some significant advantages there, especially for crops where seeding is a concern, like the cannabis in our production environment. Um, and the other advantage too is, again, because they're seedless, if you as a breeder are interested in like protecting, some of your varieties and some of your lines, if you were to develop breeding lines that were triploids, so they are now like infertile. So you can distribute these triploids and not worry about somebody, breeding with them. They would still be able to make clonal production plants or things like that. But if you have a seed line that's triploid, there's protections there that prevent other people from breeding with those. There's also some advantages too by having that extra copy of the chromosome, where now you can stack traits a little bit differently because you have an extra allele available. So an allele is a gene responsible for a certain trait. Instead of just having two copies in your normal one, you've got a third, or I mean, you could double, to 6, 8 in if you wanted to. Yeah, there's other crops that are hexaploid, octaploid. Strawberries, cotton is a tetraploid. There's a lot of our agricultural crops are actually they're not simple two chromosome copies. They're multiples of that for whether it was just natural selection that favored plants that just had these extra gene copies, or whether there was actual manipulation involved. And that's where I think cannabis, is going to shine as well, is people using that as a selection process, and applying those technologies into cannabis to combine traits in new ways. And there's some commercial producers that have been investing in that research, and some things on the market. So Max Jones, I think, reported some lines that he has out of the university that they're commercializing, or making available in different ways. I'm not exactly sure whether
Yeah.
what the structure was for that, but
Yeah, they were going to release them
having access.
commercially to get people access to them, with potentially some of the funding from that going back into the university to help further more research, which is great.
Yeah.
He did mention that, like you said, some of these things occur, I believe, naturally as well in plants. It's not all just through chemical manipulation. And I think he
Right.
said like Mac 1 from Capulator was actually triploid or polyploid. I don't remember which, a
Triploid.
triploid plant. And then,
Yep.
unintentionally so, I believe, by the breeder. And then also some of the stuff from Oregon CBD, Seth Crawford. And I think he believed there was some research presented. I can't remember if it was by Max or another researcher showing the impact on seeded outdoor crops where pollen obviously was hitting these crops. The rates of seeding was much lower, I guess, in
Yep.
these plants, the polyploidal plants. Correct?
Yeah, specifically triploids, right? So a tetraploid, one that simply had the doubling, is still going to be receptive to pollen
Hmm.
from other plants that are even copies of chromosomes. It's just a matter of whether these even copies split into uniform pairs during, sexual reproduction. Um, and yeah, that's where the triploid, because it's three, it doesn't divide evenly, and that mismatch chromosome pairing is what makes it unviable or less viable. So there's that's a major advantage in outdoor production, especially if you're near like fiber and grain type crops where there's ample pollen flying around. Um,
Yeah.
that risk is much, much lower.
All right. So last question, because we've already been chatting for a while here. What do you see as the biggest opportunities for improvement in our industry, the next 3 to 5 years?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think like obviously we've talked a lot about genetics, so I can just reiterate that point that like the improvements in genetics, I think long term are going to have more benefit than you know process improvement over time. Like it gets to a point where you've got best practices for production, fertilizer use efficiency, irrigation, all of those things are very important to successful production. Um, but there's like a limit to how much like you can be efficient labor wise, or I'm sure there's going to be some technologies or techniques that continue to push that envelope. But I think that the bigger advantage is on the breeding side, because every generation, especially if you're breeding for that ideal set of practices, like you can continue to build on those populations and find those that are best suited for that process over time. And that's where we've continued to see gains in productivity through breeding in traditional crops, year over year, decade over decade, because of variety improvement. So that's, I think the bigger driver. Um, but yeah, I'd say in for commercial operators and large scale producers, there is still a major need for process improvement and being data oriented, preparing for scale. Um, and so, yeah, as a consultant that works with producers and focuses on that, like that's kind of like the short term goals is making sure that processes are formalized, well trained on, data oriented. So I've been working through Catalyst BC, which is a consulting group, global president presence, and as a team, that's kind of the great part there is it's not just me trying to cover all bases there. Really, it's a group of like data oriented guys that and gals that work together on focusing on data management, and process improvement, SOPs, and kind of digging into what might be challenging a garden or outdoor facility, to better the process. So I like I said, I'll put genetics as like the first thing, and especially that 3 to 5 year turnover. Um, but really, the processes themselves need to be well established, if some of these operators are gonna last. It's can't really just fly off of gut instinct, and um, you really got to use data to align what we feel and those kind of gut reactions to decisions, because yeah, there's no shortage of challenges, and um, making sure that we're using data to orient ourselves is going to be critical. And not every business is really set up to look at uh, previous performance to indicate how we should grow moving forward. So, as a consultant, that's how I focus with organizations is to build a kind of a continuous improvement process workflow, so that way every harvest is something that can teach us something.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think genetics is where we can make the most strides initially because that's going to dictate to our cultivation practices as we move forward. So
Yeah.
until we have consistency on the genetic side, I don't think we can really dial in anything else, especially because my brain goes to fertility because that's something that we work with a lot of growers on, as well as
Yeah.
not just the fertility aspect of it, but how do we produce a consistency with the crop itself. So yeah, I guess we'll just see what the future has to hold there. I think we'll learn more about what sorts of what people call crop steering, what sorts of like stress
Hmm.
or intentionally induced triggers will impact secondary metabolite production without reducing yields in a positive or advantageous way. I think is going to be pretty exciting research that we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years. And then I think the area we need the most research, you already touched on, is like drying and curing. You can grow the best
Hmm.
crop ever, and if you don't dry it and cure it properly, it's so sad. It's such a waste, and I've definitely ruined crops
Yeah.
in my day too. So I would like to see better SOPs around that, and I know the Cannabis Research Coalition has done some work on that too. So
Yeah, yeah, the post-harvest side's an interesting one too. And, experience from a previous life, it was, textile processing, right? And the saying was that like you could take a okay product and process it and get like an okay, textile, but like if you took a good quality product and you processed it poorly, like there really wasn't like a room for improvement there. So like you could certainly mess up a good quality product in the
yeah,
post. And it's a lot easier to mess up something that was good than to like turn something that's not great better, right? Like I think that's where there's really no recovering if you've grown really bad product, even if you dry and cure it well.
yeah,
But you can certainly mess up a great harvest in those 2 weeks in the dry room, and beyond. So
yeah.
yeah, there's so much to study. That's like I said, where I'm excited to be a part of the industry and be able to kind of focus on a number of different things. Um,
Yeah.
So
Well, thank
yeah,
you.
I'll see you in the future,
Yeah.
man.
Thank you for your time today. I hope to run into you at future conferences, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thanks again.
Yeah. Yeah, I say Photo X was a good one. I was happy to run into you there. A lot of good science talks. So
That was Dr. Matthew Indest, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab and then podcast. Thanks for listening.